So that's the difference between brand image and brand identity. Now, how we go through that is what we learned from the best practice studies is really good companies have a very systematic discovery process that's used to assess, articulate, define, and distill the brand, its values, personality, and positioning. Was there a question? Did I hear someone there? No. Okay. And here I just want to give you a kind of a brief overview of what this whole process is. In this first column is the input. If you remember earlier on, I said that best practice companies study multiple audiences, and in general, they studied more audiences than those companies that weren't the best practice organizations. And so you see, they look at customers and prospects as distributors, alliance partners, whoever is relevant to the brand, they will go out and quite systematically solicit input and do research. Then they also do a very broad assessment across every important aspect of the business and the delivery, the pricing, the availability, the actual quality and performance. They will, stand back and look at customer needs, what's driving customer demand, what drives customer value perceptions. They'll look at competitors, they'll look at their internal practices, and then they will do deep research into the associations that all these constituents will hold about the brand. So these first two, the input and the assessment phases, are basically the discovery process in this whole idea of getting to the heart of the brand. The third step is to draw some of this together and from it articulate some core meanings and some core truths that are going to inform the rest of the process. In particular, what are the core values? Core values of the organization, like really fundamental things such as innovation, integrity, thought leadership would be, some kinds of examples. What are the core competencies that this organization really does well, and how might those be expanded to reflect their aspirations going forward? The really important part about this step is this is where in best practice organizations, the CEO, in the head of the company or whoever the highest senior level gets deeply involved in this aspect, because this is really shaping the future of the organization going forward. And so this has to be very much, this is where the brand is really linked fundamentally to the business strategy for the organization. So and one of the things that we found among all the best practice organizations was deep CEO involvement with the company at this point, not in figuring out the color of the logo or those kinds of executional things, but people like Jack Welch, and then following him, Jeffrey Immelt, are actually referred to as the chief brand manager within those organizations. So for those of you who feel frustrated that you don't get enough support from your CEO, I will say that in these kinds of organizations, CEO gets very much involved, but it's at this point, it's in helping to shape the vision and the core aspirations going forward. That then informs what we get into the real process of brand definition, where we define the entire identity as I've just explained it, and we enrich that by having clear guidelines for what are going to be the personality and the values portrayed in brand positioning. And I want to spend just a couple of minutes on personality and then leading up to brand positioning. When we talk about values or personality, if it's going to be personified, although I'm not real crazy about brand personification. We're talking about abstract associations that you define that become part of the strategy because they help serve as guidelines on how the brand is going to be portrayed in all of its communication. And here's just a couple of examples of the kinds of things that I mean, and they make sense if you know who these companies are. They actually seem very obvious if you know these companies. 3M is all about innovation. 3M is really dedicated to a constant churning out of innovative new products and always having, I think it's like a third of their revenue coming from products and services that are less than 5 years old. Along with that, they've got a very strong culture there with strong emphasis on honesty and accessibility. Now, the company that used to be Biomaterial Sciences, which is now Covestro, recently went through a rebranding, and they say their core values that are part of their brand is curious, courageous, and colorful, which are really kind of unusual words for a company and something as serious and technological as Biomaterial Sciences. But I think they're really trying to break out of the pack and really want these values to be informing what their brand is and bringing it to life. That's the purpose of these values and personality, to give you guidelines to bring the brand to life. So you also have, contrast those two with something like McKinsey. It's not that McKinsey isn't courageous, and it's not that it's not innovative. It has many of the values that those other companies have, but fundamentally, I think McKinsey is more about authority, their thought leadership that is so commanding. But in particular, not only are they thought leaders, but they are thought leaders really working directly on the very highest levels of senior management. And I think that probably makes them somewhat less accessible than a company such as 3M, or certainly less so than a company such as Zipcar. So I want to spend a couple minutes here talking about the idea of positioning, because people sometimes will get confused between brand identity and brand positioning because they're not quite the same thing. The other problem here is that the term positioning is really abused a lot in the branding field. It's abused and misused and comes to mean all sorts of different things. So you just have to be a little careful when you're talking to somebody about positioning that you know exactly what they're talking about. But I'll explain what I'm referring to here, because it's actually quite specific to how a brand is portrayed to a specific target customer. Phil Kotler, our colleague here at Northwestern, defines positioning as the act of designing the company's offer and image so that it occupies a distinct and valued place in the target customer's mind. That's, excuse me, all well and good. I would say that positioning is specific to a single target customer or a single target customer segment. So going back, we're talking about Intel a few minutes ago. So you might have one positioning to consumers to explain the value of an Intel chip to consumers, and you would have different positioning to engineers, and you would have different positioning to retailers or original equipment manufacturers. And it's got to be within that customer's frame of reference, or which is just another term for their competitive set. And it's got to be relative to what they're looking for. So what sets your brand apart, points of difference or points of parity, and usually will include some statement of reason why or rationale, and may reflect some elements of the brand personality or its character. There's a fairly well-known formula for coming up with positioning statements. Positioning statements are kind of dry, and they're usually something that you might come up with as part of the platform or the briefing that you give to the agency, an ad agency or marketing services firm that you're working with, or they may create one for you. But here's a fairly fairly simple fill in the blank kind of exercise that you can use for positioning. Just remember it's for a specific target audience. And I do have an example of one that's filled in, and this is a business-to-business example of DeWalt. Some of you who are into either do-it-yourself or have worked in the building field will know this. They make hand tools for the professional market, and the full positioning statement here is, to the tradesman who uses his power tools to make a living and cannot afford downtime on the job. That's the target. It's professionals, but also expressing their need that they need to avoid downtime. DeWalt Professional Power Tools, which is the frame of reference, it's saying we are within the frame of power tool providers. Their power tools are more dependable than other brands of professional power tools, point of difference, because they are engineered to the brand's historic high-quality standards and are backed by Black & Decker's extensive service network and guarantee to repair or replace within 48 hours. So those final points are the reason to believe. So that's a nice, clear positioning statement on how you would sell this equipment to tradesmen, primarily individual tradesmen using them for their own business. Would probably be very different than a statement that you would craft if you were selling to a great big construction company who has a whole staff of people working on the job, and if the company is buying these tools in bulk to give to their employees, you would emphasize different aspects. Would obviously still be the power tools. You're still avoiding downtime, but it probably would be group-wide and would focus on a subset of those kinds of benefits. And that kind of gets me to the point that I was trying to make here, which is this challenge of multiple stakeholders. That brand positioning is actually the tool you use to reflect different benefits to different groups, to help you sort through how it's different from one group to another one. But fundamentally, all of the positioning statements that you may produce for your brand or for a line of services have to be driven from some essential core identity values and what we refer to as brand promise, which brings us around to the last step in this promise, or in this process rather, which is distilling this down to a single expression of whether it's called a brand promise or a value proposition or a brand essence. It goes by various names in the field, but what it is, it's something that unites all of the activities of the brand